I'd like to welcome you to this discussion about creating a fundraising strategy. This is a part of QIS, but I'm sure it could be used for many other things. It's a part of project planning and design. We are often keen to find money. We often need it quickly, and yet there's a very long process to finding any money that can take sometimes 18 to 26 months. So hopefully this will give you some guidelines as to how to start creating a fundraising strategy. First of all, you need to work out who is in your fundraising team. You would always have your director or your head or your CEO, whatever you call them, and they should always be the ones who are signing off on proposals. It doesn't mean to say they write them, but they have to have their input. You also need quite a skilled writer who can convert people's program ideas into something that is very attractive. You need your program people or your education people and their input into it, and you need somebody in finance who will do your budgets. Often we do those amongst many other tasks, so you then need to agree the roles that you will be working to. How are you going to bring a program team together to discuss options for what it is that you're asking for? How will they then work with finance? And who will have the last say on what goes in and what goes out? And how will you connect all of that to the writer? I've never seen it work with more than one writer who overviews beginning to end. If everybody's writing a different part, it doesn't hang together. You will often be asked for existing approved documents. Most people will want to see your audit or your financial accounts. They will want to see your strategic plan. If you don't have these, this is something that you need to work on. And they will often ask for your last reports, your annual reports or your quarter reports. So they're the sorts of things that you should always have quickly available. You're never going to get a big grant without an audit, so that's particularly something that everybody needs to make sure is in place. They will also ask you for your registration documents, whether that's NGO or school or whatever. In terms of documents to be developed, obviously any of the above, which you don't have, you would need to get, but then they will probably ask for other things. They might ask for a finance policy. They will probably ask for a safeguarding policy, and sometimes they ask for the CVs of the lead people who will be running the work. There might be other things that they ask for as well. Even just getting through points 1, 2, 3, 4, you might recognize areas that you are not skilled in or you don't have team members, and therefore you need to identify capacity development that is needed. You're all in a network, that's why you are in this webinar, and so talking to the network about the sort of support for capacity building. They can't provide everything, but if there's several members, then it would be nice to think that some support in terms of training is possible. You will want to have set financial targets at least for 1 year, but if your strategy is for 5 years, then you might have financial targets for 5 years. There's none of us that have money in the bank for 5 years, and so that then gives you your targets for finance of what you have to raise. And your target groups is referring, in our case, to your boys and to your girls. They're your direct beneficiaries. How many? And then they will break it down into whether they have disabilities, and what type of disabilities, whether they're vulnerable or marginalized in other ways, whether they're from particular tribal groups or from refugees or whatever. If you're doing good reporting, then you should already have some sort of monitoring and evaluation system in place. It can become quite onerous and difficult at times, but having basic plans in place. And then you would want that not only for your programming, but you would also want that for your fundraising. How are you going to measure the progress that you're making? At the end of the day, it's money in the bank, but you would have to have what's called a funding pipeline, where you know what you need when you need it, and you're looking backwards 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months as to where that money is going to come from. When you're looking to identify where you might source funding from, then this table might help you to identify where you've got it from in the past. So this only says last year where you actually got your money from for these 6 different types of funding. But it might be that you have records that go back 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years. And so the first thing you would do is identify the names of your regular donors. Are they giving annually or monthly? And are you keeping in contact with them and making sure that they know what they're doing? It might be that then they're informed about your budget for this year. You would, let's say last year they gave you $100. Maybe this year they've pledged to give you 100 again. And so far, 8 months in, you've received 50. So why would that be? Is it that you've not kept in contact or some other reason? And maybe you don't ever write and say you owe me money. Just a friendly chat and news and update, and sometimes that just prods them. And then one by one, is that a source of funding that you feel you can bank on for the coming year? Or is that something that is going to reduce for various reasons? And is any of that donated? There might be rare occasions where somebody says, I'm giving you money for 2 years, but I'm giving it all of you in this year, but it has to last into this year. So they might give you your 100 here, but it's actually 50 for this year and 50 for next. So you can't spend that 50 until that year. It has to stay in the bank and wait. No matter how great the needs are, that's the rules. You're not allowed to take it in advance and spend it on something else. So look at your regular donors. Single gift donors would probably be something like your visitors, or if you've had an appeal in particular, and they're just one-offs. You go through the same process as we've just done. Trusts and foundations tend to be family trusts, where for whatever reason a family has set money aside. Sometimes they've been there for generations, and they normally come from personal contacts, or you meet them at conferences. They're looking for new ways of giving. Yes, you can trawl through various emails and sources, but normally you need personal contact for that as well. These trusts and foundations would be a bigger sum of money than your regular donors. Churches, and especially local churches in your own church, it would be nice to think that they would be investing in children at risk, but obviously you have to handle that delicately. One of the important things for churches these days is to know what actually is their mission strategy. Are they just firing off money when they feel a passion, or do they have maybe 2 or 3 people who they're particularly supporting, and how are they reaching out in their own nation? Legacies is when somebody leaves a certain percentage in their will, and you might or might not be aware of that, and until the day they die you probably won't know, because otherwise you might be tempted to do something to them. And then anything else. So what is the need? It would be good to be thinking this through before you're approaching anybody and before you're making a strategy. So what do we need the money for? Now, normally our greatest concern is salary money, which nobody generally wants to give to, and it's overheads, which are things like utilities and what else? Everything that nobody wants to pay for, stationery and office maintenance, rent, that kind of thing. With salaries goes the tax, which is your legal obligation. You have your national insurance, whatever that's called. You should have a worker's insurance, all of those obligations. You would have audits, and all of those things are necessary, and you haven't even got to what you actually need, which is your project. So the most effective way is that you divide these up. You divide up your salary and your overheads, so they become project staff, they become project desk spaces, and so the costs of these things are attributed into the project staffing costs. That seems to be the most effective way to do it, and then that minimizes the administration percentages, which are never enough to cover all of these things. What is your goal for how much you need? So again, if you've got a strategy document, then normally in there it has an estimated budget. Detailed work plans for 1, 2, 3, 5 years in advance are very difficult, especially 3 to 5 years. Nobody knows, as we well know at the moment, what's going to happen. But at least if you know what your budget was for this year, and you know whether you're going to plan to hold that same balance, or whether you're planning some small increase, or whether you're actually expecting a decrease, and then how you're going to save money. And when you know what you need, then you know how much you're looking for. When you need the money, so that is normally called a cash flow forecast, which in QIS finance module will be described. But very simply, for each month, January, February, March, April, May, June, etc., you know how much money is needed, and it won't be the same amount every month, because, for example, maybe in April you would have to pay for an audit, maybe in June you have to pay for medical insurance, etc. But at least then you know when it is that you're targeting that money. And if you've got a big new project, let's say starting December, January for school holidays, then you need to know that you should be working backwards at least 6 months to see where that money is going to come from. There's 4 objectives in your fundraising strategy here. First of all, build your donor base for unrestricted gifts. Your unrestricted means that somebody is going to give, and they don't expect particularly a specific report. You would still give them general reports, but you can use that money in the way that you need to at the time. So you can use it for staff, you can use it for fundraising, you can use it for an emergency with a child, the choice is yours. Obviously, you have to use that with care and wisdom, because when they do come back and ask you for what you have done, whilst they've given it to you unrestricted, if you just, spend it on staff, distance learning or whatever, they're going to wonder what they're doing with their money. Secondly, build relationships with the donors. These should be or should become your friends, but please don't make friends with them just because of their money. They'll see through that and they won't be your friends anymore. But build relationships. That means you keep in touch. Some of them like just a 2-3 minute video, maybe once a month, or a 2-minute summary report. Don't bombard them. There's nobody that reads hundreds of pages, but you need to build the relationships. And possibly at points in the future, you would invite them to visit, if that's possible. The best donors are always the older people who can't travel, and phone calls and letters and so on and so forth will be a great blessing to them. You can then think about your fundraising events. So maybe as you head towards Christmas or Easter or some other particular point, then you would be planning specific events to raise money. I'm always cautious of event planning because I think you can end up spending so much time and money on those events that it doesn't actually bring back sufficient income compared to the investment that you've made, but it is an option. And then think about how you're going to engage the churches. If you have your board and your staff, then at least we would hope that it would be our own churches. And you wouldn't start by asking for money. You would ask by sharing the heart and the passion and the vision for children. I know in my own church it was seen very much that the work we were doing was a service to them, until they began to see the children for themselves and began to raise funds for them and to support the network more. There's 7 different types of people who can be approached. Individuals, we've talked a little bit. Normally they would give monthly. That would mean that you need a system where you can receive that money monthly. And if they are international, we have international down here, then how are you going to do your banking? Some organizations have international banks. People generally don't like making international transfers because of the high charges. So do you have a partner? And if you have a partner in those other countries, normally they have to take a certain percent, which is at least 10%. Otherwise, the rules of charitable giving is that if all money is just transferred, it's seen as laundering, which is illegal. So you have to do those negotiations. Fringe donors are the sort of people that maybe come for a visit. They give you a one-off, they feel some compassion, and maybe they just do what they can and you'll not see them again. So you need to think about how much time and money you will invest in pursuing them. Now, of course, the major donors are the ones that we always want, but I can promise you that their hard work, the paperwork and the effort is enormous. And maybe the key thing to know about that is that until you are seen as trustworthy, which financially means that you've got years of audits and you somehow have built a reputation, and if you don't have those, then you would look to be building partnerships, partnerships with other networks, partnerships with Viva, partnerships with other countries and other stakeholders, and you begin to build your credibility that way. and do what are called consortium funding proposals. Trusts and foundations we've talked a little bit about. Normally they're from families, or they're for specific reasons, and you have to work hard at those relationships. Churches we've talked about. Local organisations, I think particularly of businesses, local businesses that are likely to give you in kind. In kind is when they give you goods. Maybe they're giving you rice or uniforms or whatever. Or you might go for some of the international ones like MTN or whoever, and they do something called corporate social responsibility. However, we found out that most of those have a 2-year waiting list. They decide 2 years in advance who they're supporting, and so don't expect anything in a hurry from those. If you want the most basic outline for a simple, let's call it a concept note, a concept is just giving the basic outline of what it is that you're looking for funds for. There's 7 points here. Who are we? So state the obvious. State your country and your city and the situation of children in that place, and the type of organisation that you are, your church or school or whatever, and what sort of work are you doing with children. I always try and get the word child in the first 3 words of anything I'm doing. A lot of all the background stuff is very boring, so as soon as you can, whether verbal or written, you should be talking about children all the time. So then you begin to explain what you do for children. And you're not explaining what happens in the office, you're explaining that this child is in situation X, and by your work you're moving them to situation Y, and in the future you want to move them to situation Z. And so what is your unique selling point? What is it that you do that's different from any other organisation? That will also be explained in your vision and your mission, which should be very clear, short, simple, memorable words or phrases. One of the networks I work with has just changed theirs because nobody could remember the mission. We knew the vision, but the mission in 10 years was not on anybody's tongue, so we've changed it to be short and memorable. So what do you want to do? If you've got this child at X, have you moved them to Y, and how are you going to move them to Z? So what is your objective? What are you going to try and do in that child's life in a month, in a year, in 3 years? Okay? If they're 5 now and you want to work with them till they're 10, what's the change going to be? What will be your added value to that child's life? And you describe it very clearly. When will you do that? That is probably the different activities that you're going to do. So in order to get them from X to Y and to Z, you're going to do things like, there has to be education there, surely, even if you're not the school itself. There has to be health, there has to be safeguarding, etc., etc. And what will you do for those things at any point in time? So make sure that the focus of your work is very clear. In the midst of all of those things, you keep those activities coming back to your vision, okay, and to your mission, and making clear the, let's call it a pathway. The pathway is described, so those little arrows, what is the journey between X and Y and Z? What is the focus of that? What is this? What is it that's going to take your energy? What is it that's going to get you up on a Monday morning and a Tuesday, and when you've had a bad day? This is a suggested table for how you can create a fundraising plan. There's 6 different types of things that you could do, and you wouldn't do all of them every month. Appeals are normally for Christmas, but most money is given to charitable organisations in October, November, December, and therefore your appeal, your Christmas appeal, would need to be ready by September. Now, you can't think about it in September. That means you're planning it in these months previous. It's possible you might also have an Easter appeal, but more than 2 in a year is probably not going to serve you well. If you're doing something like an appeal through a sponsorship thing, they say that you can't go back to the same people for 2 years. Your major donors, okay, if they're from foundations, they would normally tell you some months in advance that when their deadlines are, so you can submit for the April board meeting or for the September board meeting. And obviously you don't want to start writing that proposal in the month before. You need to be thinking about it way in advance, because it takes a long time and they might go backwards and forwards with you as well. As I've said earlier, it can take anything from 6 to 24 months to get a major donor. Events we've talked about. My guess is that you could do an event around Christmas time, and maybe depending when your long school holidays are or when visitors are coming, you might do an event, a fundraising event, but I'm skeptical as to how much they raise. Churches. You wouldn't be going to the same church in every month. You just can't do that. So are there 12 churches that you could do a visit? Okay, and then who's going to do that visit? Because you don't want to be away from your own church all the time. International donations, so I guess these would be individuals, which we've talked about already, and how you need to keep in regular contact with them, with maybe a monthly short video or a 2-minute news piece, and then you would have an annual report that you would always send to them. So things like that. But the big international donors, the USAID and the UK Aid, you might think it's your dream, but you lose your life when you get funding like that. It's very unpredictable as to when they advertise, and when you pick up on something like that, you've probably got 6 weeks to prepare, if that. And you have to be ready, if you really want that, to set aside everything else in order to get that. So the details are in this Word document, which is at the end of this slide presentation, but we'll send it as a separate document as well. And just going through those things, it's got those templates in there. And please do go back to your networks and ask for some training. Obviously, in these days, we've learnt that virtual means that we can do it at any time of the day or night. Otherwise, we pray that you see the Lord's provision at this very challenging time of life.